Many adventurers in the ages of Talaron are acutely aware of their reputation across the realms. This is important in their quests to know where they can and can't receive help. Steve is unusual in this regard, as well as he rarely had any idea if anyone thought of him, let alone what they thought of him. Between his ability to teleport and his home in Orbitus, far from any normal settlements where he might be able to pick up upon the rumors already swirling around his infamous life, he simply had no idea or concern for how he was perceived. After all, it wasn't until decades after the fact that he realized the Francomanian horror story about an evil demon trying to steal children's teeth was in fact about his failed attempt to take over for the Tooth Fairy. So unlike many of his supposed profession, he did not seek out great deeds on either side of the spectrum to cement his reputation. Even his rivals in crap would go out of their way to make lavish displays of their good intentions and charity. On the other end, there were many an evil adventurer who would be outlandishly cruel once or twice to make sure people understood who they were. But for Steve, his reputation varied wildly across the realms, from hate and scorn to adulation and worship. If someone truly needed help and asked Steve for it, he would provide it. From Kasurian peasants to elves, orcs, and even the occasional royal family. He was of the mindset to help people to ask for help, and if his deeds were to be tallied, it would be easy to see that he helped far more people than Arturian Uberdragon and crap did on the small scale. Of course, Steve also has the very large column of deeds that were in the mixed category. Not to mention the way his adventures would leave ripple effects across the world, leading to both great and terrible events in Talaron's history. For better or worse because of this, Steve Spellslinger's big adventures are fairly well known. At times, it's not known that he is the one to make them happen, but the events are still spoken about, written about, or sung slightly out of tune by drunk bards. There is an exception to these typical adventures, however. An event that was very carefully concealed from history by those in power for various reasons. It would be the first time that Steve dealt directly with global politics, instead of influencing them from a distance through his usual wild life choices. Somewhat ironic that if he had made sure to let this adventure be known to the world, he could secure his reputation forevermore. Yet if he did that, all the work in hiding it would be undone. It is perhaps a good thing for all of Talrion that such a figure cared very little for the opinions of others and how they viewed him. For while the direct consequences of this particular adventure are well known, their cause is lost to history, which is why it's so important to learn about when Spellslinger stops time. Travel. Archon! Steve was still somewhat wet as he pushed his way into the dean's office, wearing only a towel and strange rubber sandals on his feet that flipped and flopped as he walked. Archon, we have to talk! The Archon of Magic and Archdean of Orbitus looked up at him when he said that, her ethereal body filled with an image of the cosmos in the dark skies of Talaron, her eyes pale and blue like a clear summer's day. What are you doing? Her eyes quickly flashed from the pale blue to a deep red like a fiery red sunset. You're dripping wet. I had to rush here immediately. No time to dry off or get dressed, he said as he walked into her office, ignoring her growls as she watched him drip water on her incredibly ancient and expensive rug. Stephen, drying off and getting dressed takes no time at all. And why did you even need to take a shower this early? You must have just gotten up. She looked at her hourglass to see how little sand was in the bottom to mark the early morning. Look, I just had to. That part isn't important, he stressed, waving his hands in the air before quickly grabbing his towel to prevent it from falling off. Professor Afrosia, he shouted then as the Archdean waited and watched him. What about her? She finally asked, realizing Steve wanted her to. She's gone rogue, he shouted. Like you? She asked as her brow furrowed in confusion, her fiery red eyes settling back into pale blue skies. No, not rogue with quotes around it. Actually rogue, Stephen insisted. Nonsense. Professor Afrosia has been a part of our faculty for centuries. She's been loyal and exemplary this whole time. She's one of the finest researchers we've had. She's done great work restoring and recovering old texts and techniques lost to time. Steve nodded as the Archon went on about that. Yeah, but do you know where she is now? Yes, she's at her family estate in Al-Sorien. She wanted some time off to work on a pet project, though it's been a few years now that I think about it. But still, all time she's entitled to considering her work. Why? As she asked then, Steve leaned over, slapping her desk with one hand, while the other kept a hold of his towel around his waist. She's working on time magic. He waited for the Archon's reaction, but she just stared at him, arching one of distant cluster of stars that made up her eyebrows. Mages had all sorts of time magic at their disposal, after all. I mean, time travel magic, he added. What? The Archon finally gasped out. That's impossible! It's forbidden in no uncertain terms, and everyone in the past who has tried to explore such possibilities have had their techniques destroyed or lost to time, Steve followed up, only to be rediscovered by someone who might study such things. The Archon paused then and studied Steve's face. For all her doubts in him during his training and the constant complaints she had from other mages and his teachers, she realized that he'd actually done a good job with her missions. More than that, he was honest, as absurd as that sounded considering what he got up to. What proof do you have? She finally asked. As you're likely aware, her estate isn't just in Al-Sorien, it's right next to the Magistone Fortress, the biggest such fortress in all of the Western Elven kingdoms. So, scry it. When he said that, the Archon frowned, and once more thought about demanding more proof. But instead she rose and walked over to her map table. She set her hands upon it, and then closed her eyes, focusing for a moment. The map upon the table then turned into a vision of Arbitas from above, clear as day before suddenly turning black. When the Archon opened her eyes and looked at the black void of a map, she sighed. They're blocking scrying attempts. She looked at Steve, who nodded, and then set his hands on the table. But if you slide just a bit outside of range. He focused and closed his own eyes, but then had to move one hand from the table to grab his towel again. After a moment, the black void slowly slid aside to reveal a lush green countryside surrounding a small bay on the coast. While it was morning in Arbitas, it was still night around Al-Sorien, but the light of the moon and the magic scrying table illuminated the terrain. There's nothing here, Stephen, the Archdean mentioned as she watched. The waves. He tapped. Have you ever known the ocean to create identical waves? When he asked that, she watched the waves, and sure enough, each and every one seemed to have the exact same form and path. Not to mention they hit the shore in the same way. When she scrolled the map further out to sea, she could easily spot the exact location at the edge of the bay, where the ocean waves would rush in and then change into the identical waves that she'd seen. There was a line where the water of the bay clearly didn't match the random chaotic ocean. The Archdean stood there quietly as Steve noticed the stars that inhabited her body seemed to grow darker. Get dressed, I'm assembling the council, she finally declared, and Steve didn't waste time as he scurried off to get dried off and then dressed. As he walked the halls of Arbitas, he noticed how quiet things were. Most mages didn't get up early, and the students got up even later. Steve himself would normally be fast asleep if he hadn't had a startling and disruptive awakening last night to discover the truth of Professor Afrosia's experiments. By the time he returned to the Archdean's office, the rest of the council was assembled around the map. Archcaster Evelinus, Archchair Tyrinia, Arch-Sorcerer Duskmaw, Archtreasurer Goldsmith, Arch-Librarian Shadri, and last but not least, Arch-Arcanist Archibald. A name Steve always had fun saying, but now was not the time to make light of names as they stared at the map while Steve approached. Maybe it's just a temporal anomaly. Do we know this from something more dire? After all, it's not time travel, it's just time repetition, Archcaster Evelinus was saying. You know it's not, the Archdean replied simply. I've already used 2 owls to scout the fortress, and they aren't just blocking scrying magic, the fortress is armed and alert. They've got soldiers camped inside and sentinels along the walls. They're expecting an attack of some kind. Well, what can we do about it? We don't have an army. We're very clear on that, too. Archchair Tyrinia sighed. We can talk to the Kasurians and Francomanians. Goldsmith suggested, the dwarf glancing over as Steve approached. And how do you propose we get them onto the other continent? Mass teleport? He asked. That would surely draw everyone's attention. No. You need someone with a ready army that can move in a hurry and doesn't need to teleport over there. You need an army that's familiar with siege warfare and has a vested interest in making sure the elves don't get time travel magic. By now the council was staring at him as the Archdean realized what he was suggesting first. You can't be serious, she sighed. You know they don't like us. Not even you. Oh, but I am serious. Ladies and gentlemen of the council, we need aid in order to stop time. Travel. He nearly whispered that last word. Why do you keep saying it like that? The Archon asked as he waved his hands around. Because it's more dramatic. We have to stop time sounds way more serious, he exclaimed as the Archon sighed and just waved her hand. Fine, get on with it, she stressed before he grinned as he looked around at the assembled dwarves, elves, and whatever Duskmaw was. We need help from the greatest republic ever. We need help from my home. We need help from Almera, a nation of conquest, a nation of engineering marvels the world over, a nation of infrastructure and law, a nation that swore quite often. Hey, watch it! I'm fucking driving here! Come on! Hey, fuck you! I'm walking here, asshole! Steve shouted back at the cart driver in the street. Well, fucking hurry up, shithead! Fuck you! You don't own this fucking street! I'll take my fucking time! Steve huffed and kept moving at his own pace as the Archdean walked beside him, having wrapped herself in a cloak and shawl to make sure her flesh, such as it was obscured. Sorry, some crapsacks have no fucking respect around here. But the Archdean seemed to mostly be focused on looking around at the buildings as they walked through the capital of the Republic. Now, I promise not to be mad, but just come clean with me, Stephen. How long have you been helping them magically build these structures? What? Never. He was surprised at her question as he looked up and around them then. You don't expect me to believe that they built all of these without magic, do you? She asked, looking over and down at him. Most of them are older than me. Why would I risk my spot in Orbitus by tossing around magic like that? We're good engineers. But these structures are incredible. They're stone, marble at that. I've seen the castles and fortresses of Cosrian and Francomania. And you assume that's the best humans can do? Hells no. Between the local marble quarries and our understanding of arches and columns, we're very good at building. Not to mention our secret weapon, concrete. He grinned as she frowned from under her concealing clothes. What is concrete? She asked as Steve blinked. Sort of stone, but not. He wasn't sure how to explain it before waving at a large structure they were approaching. It's like that. What? It's like stone, but no stone could be formed and shaped like that, which made Steve nod. Yep, that's where we're headed anyway. It's one of the biggest structures here in the center of the city. The temple to the one god all Almerans worship. The god of war. The only god I don't actively hate. Steve admitted with a nod. I didn't realize. I know about the gods of the eastern human territories, but not this one. What is his or her name? She asked as Steve shrugged. I don't know what his previous name is, but right now it's a guy. What do you mean right now it's a guy? The Archdean asked in confusion. Do you have multiple gods of war? What? No, that's the thing about war. War changes. War always changes. So rather than being one set never-changing god, the avatar of war can be challenged and defeated, allowing the new person who embodies whatever tactic and gear is best for now to take over. It's always the same god of war, but also different. He shrugged. It's hard to explain. If we think there's a good candidate for a new avatar, there's an election held. And if they get enough votes, they're allowed to challenge the current avatar. Keeps our military sharp. Gods can't just be... You can't have elections for gods, the Archdean finally said. If we can't, then how come we do? Steve countered as he watched his boss just close her eyes and shake her head. I will argue with you about this later. Where's your brother? She pinched her nose as she tried to think upon the culture of Almera and how it defied the conventions of all other nations she knew. He's up there next to the big fucking temple, which is what the locals call it. Or BFT. We've also got the BFA for big fucking arena and the big fucking circus, and of course the big fucking library. Steve noticed that the Archon was staring at him as they walked. What? Do your people seriously name everything like that? She asked as she sighed. Oh, those aren't the official names. It's just we hardly use those, so if you tell someone you're heading to the arena and to meet there and they ask which one, you can just say the big fucking arena and they know. He shrugged while she sighed and shook her head. But by then they'd reached his brother George, standing beside the temple. Steve! His brother cried out as he stepped up and hugged Steve. Unlike Steve's purple and white toga, George was in the armor of a camp prefect. You got another promotion? Steve exclaimed after hugging his brother and standing back to look him over. What's next? Legate? Yeah, like that's going to happen anytime soon. So this is your boss? Before the Archon could bow or give any other sort of greeting, George was grabbing her forearm and clapping her on the shoulder. Well, it's an honor to meet someone desperate enough to give Steve a job. We all figured he'd be a lazy piece of shit student his whole life. Oh, fucking bite me. This coming from the moron who signed his name as X for how many years? Steve shot back as his older brother just laughed it off. Right. Well, come on, we've got to get to the Senate. They're expecting you. I spoke with my boss, just a local figure known as the consul. He emphasized the word as Steve rolled his eyes. How many fucking times are you going to try and drop that, huh? I fucking get it. You work directly for the consul now. Shit. You mentioned it like 30 fucking times already since I contacted you. Well, I work for the Archon of fucking magic. Only one of them while there's 2 consuls at any given time. Yeah, but she doesn't rule over a whole nation, does she? George said with a laugh. The Archdean hadn't even been able to get a word in as she followed after the 2 arguing brothers as they walked towards the Senate. The Grand Senate building itself, compared with several other structures in the city, wasn't even especially impressive, but it did seem to be older, which might explain why. She finally spoke up as she saw the guards when she finally noticed something. I know that Almera has a rich history of conquest, but how come I don't see any swords? She asked, making the brothers pause in their insult trading. Oh, by ancient law, swords aren't allowed in the capital, George explained. Oh. That's interesting. To try and achieve some measure of peace within the city? She asked before George coughed and went on. Well, aside from training swords and gladiators, and the ones that are made here and shipped elsewhere, and if there's martial law, not to mention what most people in the city just use hatchets and maces and spears instead. It's more about saying that the military is supposed to stay outside of the city, 'cause we all use swords. He nodded. But you mentioned there's martial laws at times? He didn't respond except to nod. So, the law doesn't work all that well, does it? Not really, no, he shrugged. But that doesn't stop us from enforcing it when it suits us. However, the guards of the Senate use fasces, which are mostly just fancy axes. But don't think they're ceremonial only. They can chop someone up pretty good with those. As they walked into the Senate building, they could hear shouting in the distance as Steve spoke up. Which consul do you work for anyway? I haven't kept up on politics lately. Gaylord Julian Cox, George said quietly before Steve just stopped in his tracks. What? You heard me? George muttered. Gaylord Cox, Steve replied. Just call him Gary. Or, consul. George sighed. Consul Cox? Steve asked. Consul Gary works fine, George growled. Gaylord? Steve just couldn't let it go. Yes. Gaylord? Yes, it's from an old elven word or something. Gaylord, I think? George shrugged. Don't fucking bring it up. He's consul for a reason, Steve. Think about it. This guy was born and raised with the name Gaylord Julian Cox. Think about how tough he is. That is actually a very good point now that you mention it. It finally caused Steve to pause and consider it for a moment before speaking further. This guy went into politics and is doing well. With a name like Gaylord Julian Cox. Gaylord Cox, G. Yes, I get it, Steve, George exclaimed, and then took a moment to sigh and compose himself as they neared the Senate, and the yelling got louder. Also, Miss Archon person, this might be unusual for you to witness. I'm used to politics, she replied. Probably not Almarin politics, George said as they stepped into the Grand Senate chamber. All around were men, women, and even a few orcs standing or sitting on the stone benches arrayed around the room. Most were yelling at one another. Shithead! Retard! Your father is a literal dog! Your father is an elf! You take that back or I'll eat your face! Even as the senators continued to yell and argue, George just ignored them and walked up to a man sitting in a simple chair next to an empty chair just like it. The man looked to Steve to be in his late 30s or early 40s, though his hair looked to starting to gray already. After George spoke to the man quietly, he stood up and raised his arms. Steve figured he was going to make some sort of grand gesture to get them to be silent, but wasn't prepared for his voice to bellow out above everyone else's. Fuckers, assholes, cunts, shout the fuck up, shut your fucking mouths, and open your fucking ears. After a moment, the senators looked at the consul, who was already sitting back down, and also took their seats. Steve blinked as the consul then waved him over. Right. Tell them what you're here to say. Steve gulped as he realized that he was standing before the ruling body over his home country and stepped forward before the assembled men and women. He paused, then realizing in all the murals he'd seen of senators they always held their arms up in a specific way. So he took a moment to try and mimic it, hoping he got it right. Do I need to stand like this? Is this good? He asked, looking back at the consul before a senator yelled out, Just fucking get on with it! Which made Steve growl, but then just toss his arms down and speak. Whatever, fuck it. Look, the elves of the Alsoriani have brought a garrison to their ancient Magistone fortress and are preparing some powerful time magic. He was going to continue when he was interrupted by another senator. Who gives a fuck? Those pussies couldn't defeat the orcs, why should we care what they do? Which caused a general murmur of consent to spread through the assembly. Time magic means they can go back in time and kill Alma herself before she can found this city, said Steve, which caused a general uproar from the Senate for a bit, until the consul behind him screamed, Shout it! To get them to quiet down once more, though one did call out, How do we know this? How can we believe you? We don't even know you're reliable. I am Steve Spellslinger. Steve started only to get interrupted once more. What kind of stupid name is that? Someone called out, which made Steve scream back. The name of your killer if you don't shut the fuck up and let me speak. The senator waved his hand dismissively, but the others murmured in approval at Steve's reply. Look, I have no fucking reason to lie about this. I'm the third human mage ever. Of all time, and I work for the Archdean of Arbitus because you shitheads wouldn't pay for my tuition like literally every other nation does. So I'm working it off on her behalf, which means I'm not doing this for me. I'm literally doing this in the name of the Archon of Magic, who does not openly ask for help declaring war on an entire elven kingdom in order to stop one of her own professors lightly. This is fucking serious. Why doesn't she speak for herself anyway? One of the orcs called out off from the side, waving at the Archdean where she stood. Because fuck you, that's why, Steve pointed back. Right, enough. The consul stood up then, walking over next to Steve. The motion is clear. We are being asked by the Archon of Magic to aid in the invasion and conquest of Alsorien. He was about to go on when Steve coughed and leaned over to whisper. Yeah, we don't have an army. Orbitus, I mean. We can only bring support. This would be almost all Almarin soldiers and the bulk of the army. The consul looked Steve in the eye for a moment, before looking back at the senators. We are being asked to provide the entire invasion force minus some magic auxiliaries, in exchange for... He paused and looked at Steve, who blinked back. If we don't do this, the elves take over the world, which made the consul sigh. In exchange for ending an unprecedented threat to humans everywhere. If the elves complete this, they'll take over the world and stop humans from ever existing. Steve wasn't sure that was true, but he didn't stop the consul either. Anyone to speak in favor? As he asked that an old withered man who barely looked able to support his own weight stood up. I move that we immediately declare war and invade. Moreover, Dargina must be destroyed and razed to the ground. He nodded at that, as another senator sighed and called out, Damn it, Grandpa! I keep telling you we own Dargina now! It's an Almoran province! Then it shouldn't be hard to destroy and raze, should it? Why haven't we done that yet? The other senators began to shout at the old man who stood proud and quiet as he began flipping them all off with both hands. Once more the consul shouted them all down. Shout up! Look, let's just get this over with. Is there anyone here who doesn't support the motion to declare war and march on the fortress immediately? Steve took a breath, then waiting to hear and see the people who weren't interested. But no one stood up or spoke. He frowned at that and looked around in surprise before the consul went on. Right, I'll negotiate with them on terms. Someone draft up a legal document for this. Why not just use one of our standard war declaration forms? A senator asked. Because we've never declared war to stop time. The consul explained as a scribe off to the side of the assembly was leafing through papers. He's right. Conquest, trade dispute, vassalization, debt collection, assisting our orc allies. We've even still got some generic forms for declaring war on Dargina, but nothing about stopping time. The scribe shrugged as the consul went on. So we get to draft a new war declaration then? Have fun with that. I'll be back. With that, he tapped Steve on the shoulder and waved for him to follow, along with the Archon. They headed out of the main Senate assembly, following the consul into another room in the structure, while Steve's brother George waited outside, standing guard. Steve could see there a large map table already set up in the room, and on it was a map of Narmisha with the current territorial holdings of Almera marked in red, and the various holdings of the Elven kingdoms and orc tribes marked in various colors. There was a large stone model of the Magistone fortress already set on the map. So my co-consul has already taken the bulk of our legions on an expedition to the north to try and expand into the Hilarans. Consul Cox explained, pointing to the tokens on the map to the far north across the splintered sea. Shit, what does that leave us with for this invasion then? Steve asked as he set his hand on his chin. On such short notice, I'm afraid only about 80,000. The consul explained, which made the Archon finally speak up. 80,000? She was clearly surprised. Yes, I know, but it's all we've got. And while I've already sent word for them to assemble, it'll take us probably a full week to be ready. He sighed out. 80,000 in a week? She exclaimed, now even more surprised. Yes, no need to rub it in, the consul growled out before Steve spoke up. No, I think she's good surprised. Don't forget Arbitas is in the east. She's used to watching the elves and dwarves assembled, and the Cosrians and Francomanians, he explained. Oh, right. They do take a while to get anything done, don't they? He shrugged as he pointed at the map. We can be assembled and marching in about a week, like I said, so give it 3 weeks from today and we'll be at their walls. You can't be serious. The Archon spoke up again. You expect me to believe that you'll have 80,000 soldiers equipped for war in a week, and then in another 2 weeks they'll march hundreds of miles? The Archon looked between Steve and Gary as they just blinked back. Yes, give or take a few days. Gary shrugged, as it should be obvious. 25 miles a day if we have to on our roads. And from the sounds of things here, we do have to. The baggage train will take longer, of course, but it's important to get there and start establishing the siege. Quick question. Steve spoke up then. You mentioned you were already ordering the legions to assemble. Don't you need the Senate's approval for that? Technically, but it's fine. Today was a mere formality. Once your brother told me what was going on, I knew they'd declare war. We've just been waiting for the right excuse to blame the elves for something, and this is perfect. The expedition to the north is only in the Hylarans to secure salt mines for our extended campaigns in the south. It's unfortunate timing, but with help from Orbitus, this siege should be easy, especially compared with my conquest of the Orcish tribes. I once had to build a wall around a city to siege it, and then another wall outside that wall to protect us from the orcs trying to lay siege to our siege. Built it all in a few weeks, too. What? Steve frowned. That's insane. He nodded slowly as he looked at the consul. I like it. All right then, it's decided, yes? We assemble the legions and some orc auxiliaries and march on the elves. You bring what support you can. Speaking of, I hear you can teleport. Is there any chance you can move around large groups of soldiers? The consul asked hopefully. No, we have to do this quietly. No mass teleport. The rest of the world has to think this is just Almera conquering an elven fort. We can't let anyone else know time travel magic is involved. Speaking of, about the Senate. Steve hesitated, now realizing he'd told them all about the time magic. Trust me, it won't be an issue. I already told the scribes not to make any mention of it. All the records will show is an unnamed spy informed us of mass 11 forces inside the fortress and a powerful magic buildup. That's all the senators will remember anyway. The ones who matter, at least. He rubbed his chin then, as he thought it over. What support can you mages provide anyway? Well, the Magistone Fortress is specifically designed to counter magical assaults. The stones absorb magic energy, making it extremely difficult for us to use offensive magic against them. We'll be able to conjure illusions, form shields, aid the wounded, and act in a more defensive and support-oriented role. We should totally negate their own magic abilities, which means this is mostly going to be an infantry and cavalry ordeal. Though the elven horsemen and archers are known to be some of the best in the world, so there is that to worry about. Steve mentioned, but the consul just laughed. Are you kidding me? This will be easier than conquering the orcs. At least they'd attack us in big masses. The elves are all about duels and one-on-one combat and glory and all that. They make great warriors and awful soldiers. A bunch of humans conquered and assimilated the giant slabs of muscle that are the orcs. We didn't do that by overpowering them. We won't defeat the elves by being better swordsmen. We'll defeat them by being a better army. As he said that, Steve laughed and waved at him. See? This is why Almera is the greatest. Now then, I do have a request. I'll need to scour the population for anyone with any sort of magic ability and train them in 2 spells. Even as he said that, the Archon growled out. Stephen! But he waved her off. We need this. And it's only 2 spells, shield and counterspell. That's it. Both Steve and the consul looked at the Archon as she sighed and crossed her arms. Fine, 2 spells only. Steve grinned at that and looked back to the consul then as he opened his arms wide. There we go. I think that's everything. But the consul spoke up then with his own final detail. Oh, actually, one last thing. The consul set his hand on Steve's shoulder and looked him in the eyes. I'm making your brother legate, and that means he has to be a senator, so I'm going to blame it on you and claim that you demanded it in exchange for the support of Orbitus in the attack. Steve just blinked as the consul walked past him then without waiting for a reply. What? Was all the startled mage could say as he watched the consul quickly head back out to the Senate assembly. You know, Stephen, I'm beginning to understand why you are the way you are. The Archon mentioned as he looked over at her, still slack-jawed and confused as his brother rushed into the room. You fucker! Why would you demand they make me legate? I don't want to be legate. I don't know how to be a senator. I hate politics. What the fuck? George had grabbed Steve by the shoulders as he shook him. But what? What just happened? I don't know what's going on. It wasn't me. I swear! Steve cried out as George kept shaking him. The Archon nearby just sighed as she shook her head. Of course, in the coming years, Consul Cox had plans for George and this new shaky alliance with Orbitus and the Archon of Magic that neither Steve nor the Archon could foresee. But that would all come after the conquest of Magistone. Steve did indeed directly set off the events that lead to the Almarin Elven Wars and have a great deal to do with that conflict. But that wouldn't be until after Steve stopped time travel.